Okay, students, let's continue from where we left off in the last class. In the previous class, we discussed some threats our networks might face. Finally, we talked about password attacks, including guessing, brute force, dictionary attacks, and password sniffing. Regarding these password attacks, how can we prevent them? Actually, there are two main points: complexity and regular change. If you maintain these 2 points, generally speaking, your password will be relatively secure. Firstly, increase the complexity of your password. For example, when setting passwords, make them as long as possible. Mix uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and special characters. Also, try to avoid patterns. Generally, passwords set by humans are often too logical. The hardest passwords to crack are those that are random. So, avoid using overly simple passwords. Besides password complexity, it's also important to change your passwords regularly. If you use the same password for years, honestly, the probability of it being cracked will increase. Also, use different passwords for different platforms. For example, if your passwords are the same across different platforms, they could be easily breached. Why? Because it's likely that a database of a particular application has been breached. Once breached, others can use the same credentials to breach other applications. After a breach, people can use the same account and password to breach other applications. But honestly, right? You say passwords are different on different platforms. Is there a way? I'll give you an example here. Different platforms, for example, different platforms. What is the name of this platform? The name of this platform inside your password, for example, can include the name of this platform, but of course, not in simple English. For example, you can take this English, use the mobile phone input method's 9 grid to turn it into numbers, right? Generally speaking, I think most people don't easily think of this point. For example, you use WeChat, right? You can use the 9 grid numbers for WeChat, insert them here. And then, for example, for IQIYI, right? For Baidu and others, you can include the name of these platforms. For example, using the 9 grid input method, insert the numbers. This way, honestly, right? Even if someone steals your password from the database, is it easy for them to crack it? No, because of your own rules, only you know them, and you can easily remember them. But others don't know. They see these numbers, and they don't know what these numbers mean. I'm just giving an example. Certainly, everyone shouldn't follow what I'm saying, right? If everyone just directly follows this pattern I'm suggesting, then maybe in the future, others might still find ways to crack it. I'm just giving an example. So, as much as possible, let's not use a bunch of identical passwords. And then, as much as possible, right? Make the passwords a bit more complex. And then, if possible, right? If possible, you can do what? You can change it, right? You can change it, right? You say if you change it too much, I can't remember. Then what to do? No problem, we still have a way. For example, you can take the year, right? You take the year, and then you say years are easy to remember, right? No problem. Can we convert it to hexadecimal, right? Insert it into the password. In that case, to be honest, it's not that easy to think of. That is to say, our passwords should be as much as possible not too logical. At least if logical, it must be deeply logical. Not that kind of very shallow logic. Also, change them frequently. Try to make them as complex as possible. Specifically, how exactly do you want to set them? Just open up your imagination, and then do it however you want. As long as others can't guess it, it's fine. So this is about the complexity of the password. Our defense against password cracking is basically complexity and also changing them often. Alright, next is the next one, reconnaissance attacks. Reconnaissance attacks, well, they can only be said to be a prelude to other attacks. Why? Because many attackers are accustomed to using various reconnaissance methods to gather information about potential victims. Then, they proceed to execute more aggressive attacks. Why do they like doing this? For example, as we discussed earlier, as we mentioned before, capturing meat chickens. Many hackers, right, For instance, if they want to launch DDoS attacks, they need to capture a lot of these meat chickens. That is to say, they want to build their botnet. So in doing so, from an efficiency standpoint, they definitely do it by various scanning, right? All kinds of scanning, casting a wide net to find those systems that are relatively easier to infiltrate. Then next, they take action equivalent to finding some systems that are easier to invade. Then they capture them and bring them over, like capturing them as meat chickens, or perform some other operations. Doing so, from the attacker's perspective, is quite efficient. There's no need, right? I mean, to be honest, right? There's no need to stubbornly stick to one place. You see, I'm telling you, I just want to go today. Just today. I want to target, I just want to hack Alibaba Cloud today, no big deal. I'll just stubbornly stick to it. To be honest, very few do it this way. So, speaking from an efficiency standpoint, often, attackers will first conduct some reconnaissance, which means doing what? They start with scanning. Of course, these methods often use so-called exclusion tools. But we need to understand that a tool, whether it's an exclusion tool or a hacking tool, depends on what you use it for. Similarly, right? You say, talking about weapons, this thing called a weapon, what exactly is it, right? Is it good or bad, right? So you talk about weapons, right? You say what can it be used for? It can be used to guard security, but it can also threaten security. So this exclusion tool is the same. That is, it essentially is just like the weapons we have in real life. These exclusion tools, they can be used for scanning. For example, they can do simple tasks, right? The simplest, like using CMD, OpenCMD, that can also scan, although nowadays hosts are basically locked down, but we still have other things like, for instance, using tools like Nmap. Tools like that can be used to scan a network. So through scanning, a hacker can find out which hosts are active and then which hosts have opened which services. At that time, based on the services you have open, they can make judgments about what type of system yours is. What type of system is yours? There might be some vulnerabilities, and then further attacks are executed. Of course, in this regard, tools like these exclusion tools like dig, NSLOOKUP, including HOIS, these can all be used as tools. For example, right, using HOIS, you can look up what? You can check your domain's registrant information, including some very detailed information. It can be done even through some websites, like HOIS, that can perform these queries through some websites. In any case, these queries can be performed through them. So in general, nearly all the network tools we commonly use can be used as hacking tools. So these tools can all be utilized by hackers. Tools themselves are not inherently good or bad. If you say that there is right or wrong in actions, it's not the fault of the tools. It basically comes down to the person. So, such scanning software can also be used by us to discover vulnerabilities in our own networks. Then, we can fortify our networks before an attack occurs. In this process, there is one thing everyone must remember. This is a principle. Minimize services. The so-called minimizing of services means that unless absolutely necessary, we should not provide any superfluous services. For example, right, say your setup is a web server. If you are a web server, then just focus on being a good web server. You say, I want to offer something else. I want to also run FTP. I want to do some other things as well. In that case, to be honest, the more services you open up in a system, the greater the likelihood of being attacked. So when we talk about security, usually remember this: minimize services. Don't open too many ports in a single system. Don't activate too many services. Because of this, why is virtualization so popular now? Why is virtualization so hot right now? The reason is because server performance has become increasingly powerful. Now, servers often have dozens to hundreds of cores. Servers with dozens to hundreds of cores. And memory that might be up to the terabyte level. With such powerful server performance, you say, if I just use it to provide one service, this one server, I just use it for a company's AD, Active Directory, isn't that honestly a bit of a waste? It really is a bit wasteful. So what do? If I say in this one server, I want to enable many services, then I wouldn't be wasting hardware resources. But doing that, to be honest, would be very low in security. So what do? A compromise solution we could do on this server is to install a virtualization platform. After installing the virtualization platform, deploy many virtual machines on the virtualization platform, and each virtual machine provides a separate service. In this way, we adhere to the principle of minimizing services. And also, we aren't wasting the devices or the server's resources. So that's why virtualization is so popular, right? This is one of the reasons. So we always try, whether in systems or networks, to minimize as much as possible. We need to follow this principle, which is to minimize services. Okay? With that in mind, so if we aim to provide minimal services, we can also use these vulnerability scanning tools to take a look at our own networks, to see if there are some vulnerabilities, some weaknesses. In doing so, we can preemptively take some protective measures. Honestly, if you block others' sniffing attempts, after blocking some sniffing, many people won't target you anymore, right? People don't often persistently attack you. When they come over and see that your security seems pretty solid, then they will likely not bother to take any further actions. This is essentially like what? Although nowadays, the profession of thieves has almost been replaced by scammers. Why is that? Because nowadays we hardly use cash. Back in the day, there were quite a few thieves. Now you say, if you secure your bag or house very tightly, would a thief wait to steal from you? They say, I just want to steal from you. I want to challenge myself. I must succeed. That's rare, right? Often they target those who seem less attentive. Finding people who seem careless. They come over, bump into you, pretend to collide, and then steal something. So attacks are similar in that our own pre-fortified systems or networks often will not be the first choice for attackers. Okay? Next topic, the next is buffer overflow attacks. Buffer overflow attacks are actually very old. Why? Because the buffer usually exists where? Usually it's in the RAM, right? In the memory. So the reason is the speed of this memory is much faster than that of external storage, including even SSDs and even things like Intel's Optane. Its speed can't match that of RAM. So how does this affect things? Many systems store frequently used data in memory. Of course, let's not quibble about that. Some might say, hey, the CPU also has a cache, right? But overall, what do we call all of it? Let's just call it cache. This cache, right, includes CPU cache like L1, L2, and L3 cache, then up to the RAM. These caches generally are not very large. So inside them, the data structures must be compact, meaning any given parameter eat a few bits, just a few bits, no more, no less. Then if you say, like if you originally have a field that is 8 bits long. Okay, then if a hacker knows your protocol very well, or understands your system very well, they might manipulate it in a way to write into this field, to write beyond the 8-bit limit. With 8 bits, the maximum number is only 255, but if they find a way to increment and write the number to 256, at that time, if your software has a vulnerability, what happens? It will use the 9th bit, right? And using the 9th bit will overwrite adjacent data. You end up overwriting what was supposed to be there. Originally 8 bits, the content of 8 bits, but suddenly there's an additional bit. This turns it into 8 ones. This is the maximum value. Then another bit is added, turning it into what? It becomes 1000. In this way, it uses up the 9th bit in front. When it occupies the 9th bit, at that point, it overwrites the last bit of the adjacent data. This kind of attack is called a buffer overflow attack. And in such cases, buffer overflow and buffer overflow attacks are not the same thing. Buffer overflow usually isn't due to an attack, but rather due to issues in the program's design. However, if someone knows there's a flaw in your program due to the design, and they target that vulnerability, then, if they know your program's design issues, they specifically target that flaw and write a large amount of data, writing extensively into that value. In that case, a section of your memory experiences an overflow, adding an extra bit, which then covers the original data. Of course, it's not necessarily just one bit. They try to cover your adjacent memory block. In doing so, it can lead to corruption of the data in adjacent blocks. Their data gets corrupted. This can lead to system errors, potential crashes, like system hangups, freezes, various crashes, failures, and such. Ultimately, it achieves an effect of denial of service. In these cases, it's called a buffer overflow attack. These buffer overflow attacks typically exploit vulnerabilities. You fill up the designated buffer area, right? And then the overflowed data covers the neighboring memory areas. In this way, this leads to significant issues. It's not necessarily the case that it will always crash. There's a more advanced technique whereby they manipulate by injecting specific values into your cache to alter the adjacent memory block into the configuration they desire. This means turning the adjacent blocks into their desired values. If done this way, it certainly leads to serious issues. Effectively, they can use this operation to inject something into your system, like malicious code. In this case, this leads to your system being compromised. These kinds of techniques honestly sound simple in theory, but in reality, they require extensive knowledge about your system, very detailed understanding. But even so, this kind of behavior is honestly hard to prevent. If you really want to defend against it, you can only do so by upgrading your software from a software and programming perspective. Just saying to cut it off, like writing an ACL to shut down that service. Honestly speaking, it could affect your regular operations significantly. So, in terms of buffer overflow attacks, usually they need to be resolved by patches. This approach too is a type of attack method. Okay, next we'll discuss man-in-the-middle attacks. Regarding man-in-the-middle attacks, we've mentioned them in the last session, right? These attacks are also a general concept. They are, in fact, a universal concept because they represent a scenario. This type of situation is not just a single technology. So here's the thing. In the case of man-in-the-middle attacks, the attacker positions themselves between two communicating systems. That is, in this scenario, let's say on the left, there's a party A, and on the right, there's a party B. A and B were originally communicating directly with each other, but at this point, at this moment, suddenly a bad actor appears. Here, there's a villain, let's call him C for now. At this point, C devises a plan to intercept the communications between A and B. He manages to proxy the communication between them. Often, this is done by deception, where C convinces C speaks to A, claiming to be B, and to B, he claims to be A. When speaking to B, he claims to be A. In doing so, he uses this dual deception to intercept the communication between A and B. Midway, it passes through C. This type of attack is called a man-in-the-middle attack. It can be executed through various mechanisms, many different techniques. For instance, by using ARP spoofing or DHCP rogue DHCP, rogue DNS, and also through routing injection. These methods hijack user traffic like ARP spoofing, for instance. This effectively allows them. Regarding ARP spoofing, here's the thing. How it works is, before a host sends out a packet, it needs to resolve the destination's MAC address. It has to do this because to communicate on an Ethernet network, the MAC address of the destination is needed. So, our host, if it wants to communicate on Ethernet, which operates at the data link layer and uses MAC addresses, this network, Ethernet, is based on MAC addresses for forwarding. Ethernet relies on MAC addresses for data forwarding. At this point, what happens is typically when the host sends a packet, it will convert an IP address using an ARP message into a MAC address. If during this time it receives a fraudulent response, for example, a host asks for the MAC address of 192.168.1.1, and then suddenly someone falsely claims that address. What is the MAC address for this IP? And someone falsely claims it, saying, it's me, then C says, it's me. In that case, if he manages to cache this mapping record, subsequently, all packets meant for that IP will be sent to C, because the host believes the MAC address for 192.168.1.1 is claimed by him, but in reality, it might not be him. It could actually be B. So, this is an example of ARP spoofing. And of course, there's DHCP spoofing as well. With DHCP spoofing, let's say a device just connects to the network. It has just come online. And after coming online, it needs to obtain an IP address through DHCP. At that point, C assigns an address to A, acting as a rogue DHCP server. C allocates an address to A and sets itself as the gateway or perhaps the DNS server, the DNS, pointing to a false address. This leads to what outcome? It results in, as a result, A sends the data packets to C. For instance, when C assigns an address to A and writes itself as the gateway, then if A wants to access other network endpoints, it must send the packets to C. Then C forwards them, acting as a middleman. Through DNS similarly, for example, let's say A wants to go to, for instance, access something. Say A wants to access Taobao, to visit Taobao. He, for instance, accesses Taobao. At that time, he will go through DNS to resolve, right? He says, Taobao, what's the IP address for Taobao's domain? At that point, if he is directed to a corrupted DNS server, then that DNS server, if he resolves an incorrect IP address and that IP leads to a phishing site, then it's very likely that A's information could be leaked, right? So this type of situation with DNS and IP routing protocols, we discussed last time how it can inject certain routes into the network. Like this, injecting routes to manipulate traffic. Typically, the injected routes have longer metrics, which then hijack user traffic. Thus, these man-in-the-middle attacks use various technical means to divert traffic to the attacker. Then, after that, they can manipulate the user's traffic as they please, doing whatever they want. At that point, at that time, effectively acting as a rogue, illegal proxy, so to speak. It's somewhat like an illegal proxy, right? By proxying user sessions, this type of attack is called a man-in-the-middle attack. Such man-in-the-middle attacks allow for sniffing sensitive information, as well as actively tampering with or injecting data. These man-in-the-middle attacks, to be honest, you might think they require high technical skills, but actually, they don't. So it's quite possible to encounter them, regularly even, and sometimes not even intentionally. Like, take DHCP for example. Consider this. What if within a company, there's a possibility within its network, where in a corporate environment, connected user devices link to the access switches? In this scenario, the Ethernet cables, for example, are directly connected to the workstations, directly connected to each desk. And then, at these desks, there's an Ethernet port available. At this point, the employee feels that one port is not enough. They need more connectivity. Wanting to expand, at this moment, the employee takes an action. They bring a small router from home, a typical home router, and they bring it to work. Then they connect this Ethernet port to the LAN port of the home router. they connect it to the company's workstation interface. With this setup, these home routers are typically set to enable DHCP by default. Thus, they start allocating IP addresses to other devices in the network, distributing IPs. In this way, eventually, due to many hosts receiving incorrect IP addresses, issues arise. Investigations start, revealing, surprisingly, in some corner, an unauthorized device. So, such setups may not always be intentional, but the risks are significant. Of course, while what I described isn't a man-in-the-middle attack, the underlying issue stems from the DHCP mechanism. Even though I said earlier that scenario wasn't a man-in-the-middle attack, in reality, the mechanisms involved that lead to issues are related to the DHCP. This means a man-in-the-middle attack can use this to sniff sensitive information, actively alter data, or even cause disruptions. They might also prevent internet access, creating blockages just because they don't want you online. For instance, consider an issue with internet bandwidth. If the internet is slow and the gateway is overloaded, the user experiences delays. So, what happens? They might decide, I'll handle it this way. By some means, I'll redirect your traffic to a specific place, and once it's there, just drop it. Directly eliminate it. In this way, only they can use the public network exit. Thus, of course, the internet is faster. In such cases, though it might not be classified as a man-in-the-middle attack, honestly speaking, such activities are not far off. Frankly, these types of attacks essentially are similar to the ones we've discussed before. They are pretty much the same. So, in this context, such man-in-the-middle attacks, they are, in a way, relatively speaking, quite easy to encounter. It's common to come across them in work. Alright, regarding this diagram, on this side, this diagram shows, let's take a look here. Here we have a host DB. At this host B on this side, there's an ARP table. This ARP table, it states 10.1, 1.3. This one corresponds to what exactly? It corresponds to that. They say it corresponds to an address, a MAC address. Logically, this 10.1.1.3 should correspond to A's MAC address. At this time, B then makes a request. When requesting A's MAC address at that moment, the attacker responds claiming that the address 10.1.1.3, this address, belongs to him, and then he provides his own MAC address to the network. He tells the network, the attacker, of course, it's also possible that the MAC address he provides is fake, potentially fabricated by him. Why is that? Because it's like this. From the perspective of switch operations, a switch, when it receives a data packet, it records the original address, meaning, at this point, even if the attacker fabricates a MAC address, in this case, as long as the data is sent to the switch will record it in its MAC address table, which means the attacker, in effect, performs this ARP poisoning. As others want to know, they go conducting this ARP poisoning. People want to know the MAC address of 10.1.1.3. Then the attacker can fabricate a MAC address. Let's say it's a fake one. But when it reaches the switch, it's already achieved its purpose, because at that point, the switch has been tricked, fooled into believing the fabricated address. This then results in the intended IP's traffic being redirected to the attacker. So essentially, this attack method, it uses the protocol's vulnerabilities, specifically the ARP protocol, ARP, which involves Address Resolution Protocol. This protocol inherently doesn't have built-in security measures. So, exploitation is indeed possible. Essentially, its design, it wasn't designed with high security measures. Thus, an attacker can exploit this to achieve their goals, such as ARP spoofing, by intercepting or even manipulating the traffic meant for someone else. This is indeed quite a common tactic. So, With man-in-the-middle attacks, honestly, they are quite common, very common indeed. So, these are the main points we've covered about network security. Next, we'll explore another aspect of network security, which involves the methods we discussed today. If anyone has questions about what we've covered today, you can ask now. Or, if you have any issues with the topics discussed, feel free to discuss them. Alright, that's it for today's session.